The well rope came up frozen solid. Martha Kinney hauled on it with hands already numb from cold, but the rope was no longer rope. It was a rigid column of ice, fused to the bucket somewhere below, immovable. She had drawn water from this well every morning for 11 years, and now the well was dead, frozen from the surface to whatever depth the cold had reached, which was deeper than anyone had believed possible. She looked across Crestwood, Colorado, and saw the same scene playing out at every homestead within sight. Men and women struggling with frozen pumps, frozen wells, frozen rain barrels. Children sent to the creek, returning with empty buckets, reporting that the water was solid to the bottom. The stock tanks that watered cattle and horses had become blocks of ice overnight, and the animals were beginning to show the wild-eyed desperation of creatures who sensed that death was coming but could not understand why. It was January 19th, 1888, and the temperature had not risen above zero for 17 days. The cold snap had descended on the Colorado high country like a judgment. Temperatures of 30, 40, 50 below zero, readings that old-timers swore they had never seen, that seemed to belong to some Arctic wasteland rather than the foothills of the Rockies. The snow that had fallen in December was now compressed into a crust hard enough to walk on, and beneath that crust, the earth itself had frozen to a depth that no one could measure. Every source of water that the people of Crestwood depended upon had succumbed to the cold. Every source except one. 3 miles up Ember Canyon, where a spring-fed waterfall tumbled 40 feet into a pool surrounded by ice-glazed rocks, a woman named Dagy Sorensen filled her bucket from water that flowed as freely as it had in July. The falls roared with their usual thunder, the spray coating everything nearby with ice, but the water itself remained stubbornly, impossibly liquid. And behind that curtain of falling water, in a cave that Dagy had discovered and developed over 3 years of patient work, the spring that fed the falls emerged from the rock at a constant 47 degrees, warm enough to keep the pool unfrozen, warm enough to sustain life when every other water source for 20 miles had turned to stone. She had tried to tell them. When she first discovered the cave in the summer of 1884, she had shared her excitement with anyone who would listen. A cave behind a waterfall, fed by a warm spring that never varied in temperature, that would never freeze no matter how cold the winter became. It was a miracle of geology, a gift from the earth that could serve the whole community if properly developed. They had laughed at her, a widow living alone in a cave behind a waterfall, claiming that her spring would never freeze. It was too absurd to take seriously. The men of Crestwood knew about cold, knew about water, knew that everything froze when the temperature dropped far enough. The Norwegian widow with her strange ideas was simply touched by grief, seeking meaning in geological curiosities that meant nothing. Now their wells were frozen, their streams were frozen, their cattle were dying of thirst while standing in snow, and Dagy Sorensen's impossible spring was the only liquid water for 20 miles. She looked out at the frozen world from behind the curtain of falling water and felt no satisfaction in being proven right. She felt only sorrow for what was coming, for the people who would swallow their pride and climb the canyon, for the animals that would die before their owners admitted they needed help, for the children who were already being rationed to cups of melted snow that could never provide enough. Her gray mare, Frost, nickered from the stable she had built in an alcove of the cave. Dagy had named her for the color of her coat and for the season when she had been born, a choice that seemed prophetic now. "They'll come today," she said to the horse, "or tomorrow, They cannot wait much longer. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the mountains, the high desert, or somewhere the cold freezes everything solid. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the only unfrozen water belongs to the woman they dismissed. Dagy had come to Colorado in the spring of 1881, following her husband Eric, who had heard that the mountains held silver for those brave enough to dig for it. They had filed a claim on 40 acres in the foothills above Crestwood, built a small cabin, and begun the hard work of extracting wealth from reluctant rock. Eric had been a fisherman in Norway, strong and capable, but entirely ignorant of mining. And Dagy had been a farmer's daughter who knew nothing of the American West. They had learned together, struggled together, and for 2 years they had been happy despite finding little silver and less gold. Eric had died in the winter of 1883, caught in an avalanche while checking his trapline in the high country. They had found his body in the spring when the snow melted, perfectly preserved in the cold that had killed him. Dagy had buried him on the ridge above their cabin, in a grave she dug herself, and she had stayed on the claim because she had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. The cave had been her discovery, her project, her reason to keep living when grief threatened to swallow her whole. She had found it in July of 1884, hiking up Ember Canyon in search of a rumored fishing hole. The waterfall had drawn her attention, a column of white water falling from a cliff into a deep green pool, but what had caught her breath was the darkness behind the falls. A gap in the rock just visible through the spray that suggested a cavity beyond. She had climbed around the pool, soaking herself in the spray, and squeezed through the gap into something wonderful. A cavern, perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, lit by the diffused light that filtered through the falling water, its walls glistening with moisture from the spring that emerged from the rock at the back of the cave. The spring water was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the icy creek outside. And it flowed year-round, feeding the waterfall that had concealed the cave for centuries. Dagy had recognized immediately what she had found. In Norway, her grandmother had told stories of the sacred springs, water that emerged from the earth at constant temperatures that never froze, that had sustained villages through the worst winters. Such springs were rare, precious, often the sites of ancient settlements. To find one here, hidden behind a waterfall in the Colorado mountains, felt like a message from the old country, a gift from the grandmother she would never see again. She had spent 3 years developing the cave. She had widened the entrance, making it accessible without the dangerous climb through spray. She had carved channels to direct the spring water into collection basins. She had built a small stable alcove where frost could shelter during storms. She had created storage spaces for supplies, sleeping quarters lined with pine boughs, a fire pit with a natural chimney crack that drew the smoke upward and out. The cave had become her true home, the cabin below serving only as a connection to the town and the life she was expected to live. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The people of Crestwood had noticed her project, and they had not approved. Silas Drummond was the first to voice the consensus. Drummond owned the mercantile that served as the commercial and social center of Crestwood, and he considered himself the town's leading citizen. He was a practical man, or so he believed, and practical men knew that widows should not live in caves, that Norwegian superstitions about sacred springs were foolishness, and that any woman who preferred a waterfall to proper society was probably not right in the head. "The Sorensen widow has gone native," he announced at his store one autumn afternoon, where the townspeople gathered to purchase supplies and exchange gossip. "She's living in a cave behind the falls like some kind of hermit, claims the spring will never freeze, that it's some kind of miracle water from the old country." The laughter had been immediate and sustained. "Never freeze?" scoffed Clayton Marsh, who owned the largest ranch in the district. "Everything freezes when it gets cold enough. That spring will be solid as everything else come January. She'll come crawling back to civilization then, mark my words." Drummond's wife, Cordelia, who organized the women's social activities and wielded considerable influence over who was accepted and who was shunned, offered her own assessment. "The poor creature is clearly affected by her husband's death, living in a cave, talking about miracle springs. She needs help, not encouragement. Perhaps we should send the Reverend to speak with her." The Reverend had been sent. Dagy had received him politely, shown him the cave, explained the geology of warm springs and constant temperatures, and watched his eyes glaze over with the particular blankness of someone who has already decided not to understand. He had departed with prayers for her sanity and recommendations that she return to proper housing. She had continued her work. The cave was real. The spring was real. The constant temperature was real. Whether the people of Crestwood believed in these realities or not, the realities would persist. The winter of 1887 to 88 began normally. December brought snow that accumulated gradually, and the temperatures dropped to familiar levels, cold but manageable. The wells of Crestwood flowed steadily. The creeks ran beneath their ice coverings. Life continued as it always had, and the widow in the cave behind the waterfall was forgotten as a minor eccentricity, unworthy of sustained attention. Then January arrived, and the cold came with it. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The temperature dropped below zero on January 2nd and did not rise again for 3 weeks. The readings were extraordinary. -20, -30, -40 on the coldest nights. The snow that had fallen in December hardened into a crust that squeaked underfoot. The trees cracked in the cold, their sap freezing and expanding, splitting trunks that had stood for a century. The air itself seemed to crystallize, turning breath into clouds of ice that fell tinkling to the ground. The water began to fail on January 10th. The shallow wells froze first, the hand-dug wells that served the smaller homesteads, the ones that had never failed before because winters had never been this severe. Within days, the deeper wells followed. The cold had penetrated the earth to depths that no one had believed possible, turning the water table itself into a solid mass that no pump could draw from. The creeks froze next, not just a surface layer of ice, but frozen solid to the bottom. Their flow stopped entirely. Their pools transformed into blocks of ice that mocked the thirsty animals standing beside them. The stock tanks that ranchers had filled in autumn became useless. The water was there, visible through the ice, but unreachable. By January 15th, Crestwood was in crisis. The first cattle died on January 17th. 3 of Clayton Marsh's prize breeding stock, found frozen beside a water tank they had been trying desperately to break open. More followed. Horses began to fail. The pigs that families kept for meat, the chickens that provided eggs, the milk cows that sustained children. All of them needed water that no longer existed in liquid form. The people fared little better. They melted snow, of course, but melting snow was desperately inefficient. A bucket of snow yielded perhaps 2 inches of water, and the fuel required to melt it was itself becoming scarce. Families rationed what water they had, going unwashed, barely drinking, watching their reserves dwindle toward nothing. Silas Drummond called an emergency meeting at the Mercantile on January 18th. The townspeople gathered with the hollow expressions of people facing a disaster they had not prepared for and could not control. "We have perhaps 3 days of water remaining," Drummond announced, his practical confidence entirely absent. "The wells are frozen. The creeks are frozen. The snow we can melt is not enough to sustain both people and livestock. If the cold does not break—" He could not finish the sentence. It was young Abigail Marsh, Clayton's daughter, who spoke the words that no one else would say. "What about Mrs. Sorensen? Her spring behind the waterfall? She said it would never freeze. What if she was right?" The silence that followed was thick with pride and shame, those two forces warring behind the eyes of people who had mocked the widow and now might need her. "That spring will be frozen like everything else," Clayton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Norwegian superstition about warm springs, it's nonsense." "Then we lose nothing by checking," Abigail replied. "And if she was right, we gain everything." A party was organized. Clayton Marsh, Silas Drummond, and 2 younger men strong enough to make the climb if the trail was difficult. They set out on the morning of January 19th, following Ember Creek up the canyon toward the waterfall that everyone assumed would be silent and frozen like everything else. They heard it before they saw it. The roar of falling water, impossibly loud in a world that had gone silent, echoing off the canyon walls with a sound that seemed to belong to summer rather than the depths of winter. They rounded the final bend and stopped, staring, unable to process what their senses were reporting. The waterfall was flowing. The pool at its base was liquid, steaming faintly in the cold air, surrounded by fantastic ice formations where the spray had frozen, but the water itself remained free. The falls thundered down from the cliff as if the winter did not exist, as if the cold that had killed wells and creeks and cattle meant nothing to this particular water in this particular place. And behind the curtain of falls, barely visible through the spray, a door of fitted planks stood in what appeared to be the entrance to a cave. Dagy emerged before they could approach. She wore a heavy wool coat and a calm expression, as if she had been expecting them for days. "Gentlemen," she said, "I wondered when you would come." Clayton Marsh found his voice first. "The spring is not frozen." "No, it never will be. The water emerges from deep in the earth at 47 degrees. It does not care about the temperature of the air." "We thought—" He stopped, unable to complete the admission. "You thought I was mad. You thought the spring would freeze like everything else. You thought Norwegian superstition was foolishness." Her voice was even, without anger, stating facts rather than accusations. "And now your wells are frozen, your cattle are dying, and you have come to the madwoman's cave to ask for water." Drummond stepped forward. "Mrs. Sorensen, the town is in crisis. People are rationing water. Children are going thirsty. Livestock are dying. If your spring can help—" "It can," Dagy said. "There is more water here than Crestwood could use in a year. The question is not whether the spring can help. The question is whether you are willing to accept help from someone you dismissed as touched in the head. The men exchanged glances. Pride, that deadly sin that had built and destroyed empires, was written on their faces. But so was desperation. "We are willing," Clayton said finally. "We have no choice." Dagy nodded. "Then we have work to do. The path to the cave is passable, but it will need improvement if we are to haul water for the entire town. I will need help, strong backs and willing hands. And I will need your word that when this is over, when the thaw comes and your wells flow again, you will not forget what happened here." "What do you want?" Drummond asked. "Only acknowledgement, only the understanding that sometimes the old wisdom knows things the new ways have forgotten. I do not want payment. I do not want praise. I want only for Crestwood to remember that a widow in a cave saved them, and to treat the next person they do not understand with more kindness than they treated me." The water hauling began that afternoon and continued for 6 weeks. Dagy organized the effort with an efficiency that surprised the men who had assumed she was merely eccentric. She established a schedule, teams of 4, rotating every 6 hours, hauling water from the pool below the falls to collection points where families could retrieve it. She showed them how to pack the water in insulated containers that prevented freezing on the journey down the canyon. She opened her cave to those who needed shelter during the long, cold hours of waiting, sharing the warmth of her fire and the food from her stores. The spring proved even more productive than she had promised. The flow was steady and strong, emerging from the rock with the same 47-degree warmth, regardless of how cold the air became. The pool never froze, the falls never stopped, the water never failed. For 6 weeks, while the rest of Colorado suffered through the worst cold in living memory, Crestwood survived on water from a cave behind a waterfall. The livestock losses were significant. Perhaps 30% of the cattle and horses in the district died before the water supply was established. But they would have been total without the spring. The children who had been rationed to cups of melted snow now had enough to drink, enough to wash, enough to maintain the basic functions of life. The town that had been facing extinction instead endured. Cordelia Drummond was among those who spent time in Dagy's cave, waiting her turn to haul water. The woman who had organized the Whisper campaign against the Norwegian widow now sat by her fire, accepting her hospitality, forced to confront the person she had dismissed. "I called you affected," Cordelia said, on the 3rd week, her voice barely audible over the roar of the falls outside. "I said you needed help, that your cave and your spring were signs of a mind unhinged. I organized the other women to pity you." Dagy continued stirring the soup she was preparing for the water haulers. "I know. How can you be so calm? We were cruel to you. We excluded you. We laughed. Cruelty and laughter do not change the temperature of a spring," Dagy said. "The water is 47 degrees whether you mock me or not. Reality does not require your approval to exist." She looked at Cordelia with eyes that held neither anger nor forgiveness, only a kind of patient understanding. "In Norway, my grandmother told me that every village has someone who knows things the others do not understand. Sometimes that person is honored. Sometimes that person is mocked. But when the crisis comes, when the wells run dry and the world turns cold, the village always finds its way to the one who knew. It has been this way for 1,000 years. It will be this way for 1,000 more." The gathering came in March, when the thaw had finally begun and the wells of Crestwood were showing signs of recovering. The townspeople assembled at the mercantile, not to shop, but to reckon with what had happened. Silas Drummond spoke first. The merchant who had called Dagy gone native now stood before his community with the humility of a man who had been proven comprehensively wrong. "I laughed at Mrs. Sorensen for 3 years," he said. "I called her cave foolishness. I said her spring would freeze like everything else. I was so certain that I knew better than a woman from the old country who had studied springs and water all her life." He paused, gathering himself. "My store is open today because of her water. My children are alive because of her water. Every person in this room owes their survival to the woman I dismissed as touched in the head. I do not know how to make that right. I only know that I was wrong, and she was right, and Crestwood exists because she chose to help us anyway." Clayton Marsh spoke next. The rancher who had lost 30% of his herd stood with the weight of that loss visible in his bearing. "I lost good cattle this winter, good horses, animals I had bred and raised and valued, but I would have lost everything without the spring, every animal, every drop of water. My whole operation would have ended in frozen carcasses and empty tanks." He turned to Dagy. "Mrs. Sorensen, I told my daughter that your spring would freeze like everything else. She believed in you when I did not. You saved my family's livelihood because an 18-year-old girl had more wisdom than her father." Others spoke. The women who had excluded Dagy from their circles. The men who had questioned her sanity. The families who had hauled water from her cave for 6 weeks while their own wells sat useless. One by one, they acknowledged what they had done, what she had done, and the chasm between their expectations and reality. When the testimonies were complete, Dagy rose from her seat at the back of the room. She walked forward with the quiet dignity of a woman who had never sought attention and did not want it now. "My grandmother taught me about springs," she said. "She taught me that water from deep in the earth carries the warmth of the earth with it. She taught me that such springs are rare and precious and should be protected for the generations that will need them. I did not discover the cave to prove anything to anyone. I discovered it because I was lonely and curious and seeking something to give my life purpose after Eric died." She looked around the room. "What I ask now is simple. The spring will not freeze next winter either, or the winter after, or any winter for 1,000 years. It belongs to everyone, not just to me. I ask that Crestwood protect it, develop it, make it available to all who need water in the hard times that will surely come again. I ask that the path be improved, that shelters be built along the route, that the spring become part of this town's inheritance rather than one woman's secret." She paused. "And I ask that when the next person comes to Crestwood with knowledge you do not understand, about water or weather or anything else, you listen before you laugh. That is the only payment I require." Thank you for watching this story about Dagy Sorensen and the cave behind the waterfall. When we mock what we do not understand, we sometimes lose the wisdom that might save us. If this story reminded you that the old ways carry knowledge the new ways have forgotten, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed your knowledge as foolishness until the day they needed exactly what you knew? That summer, the town of Crestwood improved the path to Ember Falls. They built shelters along the route, constructed a proper water collection system at the pool, and established the spring as a public resource available to all. The cave behind the falls was designated an emergency shelter, maintained and supplied for any crisis that might come. Dagy remained its keeper. She continued to live in the cave that had been her refuge and her vindication, maintaining the channels and basins she had carved, welcoming visitors who came to see the spring that never froze. She became something of a local legend, the Waterfall woman, the keeper of the warm spring, the Norwegian widow who had known what no one else could believe. The phrase "asking Dagy" entered the vocabulary of Crestwood and spread to neighboring towns. It meant seeking knowledge from unexpected sources, listening to wisdom that came from outside the mainstream. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker remembered what happened when a town refused to ask. Dagy Sorensen lived behind her waterfall for another 37 years, passing in the spring of 1925 at the age of 79. She was buried beside Eric on the ridge above their original cabin, but her true memorial was the spring that continued to flow, the cave that continued to shelter, the water that continued to sustain. The path to Ember Falls is maintained to this day. The spring still emerges at 47 degrees, still feeds the waterfall that roars through every season, still provides water that never freezes no matter how cold the winter becomes. Visitors come to see it, the impossible spring, the cave behind the falls, the gift from a widow who knew what no one else would believe. Above the entrance to the cave, carved in letters that Dagy added sometime in the years after the Great Freeze, is an inscription in both Norwegian and English. Van liv, water is life. Her grandmother, who had taught her about springs in a village half a world away, would have recognized the truth in those words and wept with joy to see how far the lesson had traveled.